Hi, we continue today in Genesis 4 with the story of Cain and Abel. And for a story that has generated so much art and folklore and symbolic expression in both U.S. and world culture, how many times has Am I My Brother's Keeper been in literature or implied in one way or another, although we're not getting that today. The story is amazingly simple and short. As you can see on the left side of the screen, we left off at the end of verse 5 last time, and we're only going to do verses 6, 7, and 8 today. But the entire relationship with Cain and Abel is in these verses. Set up last time, as we saw in verse 4 and 5, with their separate offerings, although there's no interaction between Cain and Abel in that situation. No, I knew Yahweh would like my offering better than yours, or any kind of sibling rivalry named there. They just each offer for, again, as we saw last time, reasons that are not stated. And they don't actually talk to each other ever at all. So we see in verse 4 and 5 the setup. We see in verse 6 and 7 Yahweh's warning and attempt to help. And then in verse 8, the first murder, fratricide. And it's as simple as can be, despite countless efforts to try to specify how it happened or to picture it, as we'll see some examples of. So let's enter into this mysterious and powerful and incredibly brief story now. So you see on the right side of the screen, as we're continuing to see how chapter 4 is connected with chapter 3. You see on the left side of the screen those sevens that connect it, and then you see down on the bottom left the parallels that we began to look at last time between the Garden of Eden story, consequence for eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and what followed in the similar pattern here that we'll see both in this video and the couple that follow. On the right side, you see the three-part structure of the chapter. So you can see now that we're going to look at a couple of parts, verse 6, 7, and 8. They're the center of this first section. We also looked briefly last time at this chiasm that sets up, again, the parallels between the Garden of Eden story and the first parts of chapter 4. So you see now that we're in that first of the blue sections and then the dialogue at the center there. So that's where we'll be picking up today. And I'm going to put on the screen the Bible Hub translation issues, because there are not only translation issues here, but some mysterious aspects of the text that are almost impossible to see in the English translation. So let's pick up here in verse 6. So we see here, this is scene 2, and as the note below says, God repeats the narrator's knowledge of Cain's emotions without the very. So we saw in verse 5, the narrator told us Cain was very angry, and his countenance, or his face fell. And Yahweh said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen?" That's the easiest part of what we're going to explore here. We'll note that this is parallel with the call to Abram in chapter 12, where only the reader knows who the voice is. So we as readers know it's Yahweh said to Cain, but Cain has no idea who this voice is. Do we know that Cain knows anything about Yahweh? Have his parents told him anything? Nothing in the text tells us anything about how they were raised or what the parents told them. All we saw was his mother's proclamation that she had made or created a man, but that was just at the moment of delivery, and no parental-child conversation is reported at all. So we don't know what Cain knows, and this voice just comes out of nowhere, and as we see in jumping to verse 8, he doesn't respond to it, although they will talk again in the aftermath, although it's still not clear that he knows who is speaking to him. So what we see here is Yahweh, and again in the form that the Yahwist author traditionally understood as more interventionary, more personally related to people than the so-called priestly author, who's often understood as transcendent and above and beyond things. So this Yahweh engages directly with people here with Cain, just as Yahweh did with the snake and the man and the woman in chapter 3. But notice that it's asking the question of why the feeling. Like a good therapist here, exploring the feelings, and both in terms of naming an emotion, anger, but also in terms of the body language. Why has your face fallen? For a text that doesn't allow pictures, it's an amazingly powerful picture here of this fallen face as an expression both of anger and obviously also of disappointment. And then we get to the incredibly difficult verse 7, and that first part especially has generated a wide range of translations, as you can see here. The first phrase is probably simple enough: if you do well. The word here, tetiv, which is repeated, also repeated in the verse again, so we see if you do not do well. So that word is repeated. That part's easy. But will you not be accepted is the hard part, because the Hebrew here, sa'et, from nas, has a root meaning of lift or to carry, but it can also make dignity or honor. So we see that wide range of them here. You see the literal translation from the Hebrew, and the first part is, simply as well or right, and not a lot of difference there. It has to do with good behavior. But the response, a number have the question of not be accepted, but notice, will you not be accepted? You will be accepted. So it was a rhetorical negative question versus a straightforward one here. But also there are other aspects, like Everett Fox, who's done more detailed study of the Hebrew than almost anybody alive, puts it this way: if you intend good, bear it aloft, but if you do not intend good, something else. And that's where the following part is not so difficult to translate. Or you can bear it, so that sense of carrying it with you. Here Wenham changes it in a completely different direction. Is there not forgiveness if you do well? Suggesting something from outside rather than something you can bear. Wittenberg here offers a whole other one. If you intend what is good and beneficial and you succeed, you will be proud. Well, that's very different. Van Wolde offers, if you do well, if you do good, well, will, that's a typo on my part. If you do good, will you not be raised up your face, which is to accept the countenance thing there, although there's no word for face in this verse. And Casuto finally, surely if you do well, you should be upstanding. So very difficult to translate there, and impossible to know exactly what is meant. But plainly, it's something of an invitation to do well or to not do well. And if you do well, there's certainly some sense that we can see from this verse that there'll be a good outcome. But if you do not do well, something strange is described here, and that's what I want to make sure that we have this on the screen so we can both in the Hebrew and the English. Sin. The first time we're seeing sin. There was no sin in the Garden of Eden, so if you were taught original sin or the fall, there's no fall, there's no original sin. Those are labels based on readings of the text, not based on the language of the Hebrew itself, but often on Christian Platonic philosophical presuppositions. So sin, hatat here, is lurking at the door. And as I've often asked undergraduate students, some who were raised in Catholicism and some in Christianity, I have also asked you watching this, how has this changed your sense of sin? So many people think of sin as a concept, a rule that you violated, a list of sins like the Ten Commandments or others. Lying is a sin, or murder is a sin, etc. So if you engage in an act, you've sinned by breaking a rule. Classic definition by Martin Luther was sin as being curved in on oneself, so it had to do more with the relationship between whether one is in relationship with God or just self-enclosed. And that probably is closer to the biblical notion than the notion that sin is something violating a rule in a manual. But here is something completely different. Sin like a predatory animal lurking. And it could also mean lying on a couch, and as you can see from my note below, this may come from the Akkadian word rabisu, which is a participle of the same stem here, meaning a class of demons and a hated category of government officials. The question is whether the Akkadian word from the Babylonian influence would be relevant here, and if we're reading this as an exilic text, it certainly might well be. So sin in this sense like a government official waiting to pounce on you, which in a later cultural context, the Persian one was the form of the Satan, from Aramaic, the Satan, the Persian imperial spy. So maybe here that sin, parallel to Satan from a different cultural context, is the official who would pounce on you. As Casuto notes there, sin wishes to master you and have dominion over you like the state officials who seek to impose their authority over the people. Whether like an animal or like an FBI agent waiting to pounce on you, there it is being presented. But its desire is for you and you can master it. The word for desire here implies often sexual desire, as you can see explicitly in this verse from the Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 10. I am my beloved's and his desire is for me. The only other place it's used in Genesis is in 3:16, where it was, your desire shall be for your man, in part of the curse to the woman. So here, as my note suggested, functions to link the demonic urge to a call to sexual union, like to be bonded with sin in that intimacy that one is meant to be bonded with one's sexual partner in a God-created union here. So it's desiring to take deep and intimate hold of you, but you must master it. And again, a word that we heard from the previous chapter in 3:16, as we heard Carol Myers talk about that there, and also back to the first creation story in chapter 1, verse 18, about human relationship over the earth and other things. So here you must master this force that's waiting to pounce on you. But Cain doesn't respond. Instead, we get to verse 8. And verse 8, we really need to look in the Hebrew here, because although the biblical text in Bible Hub doesn't show this, in the original Hebrew manuscripts there was often a space. So what we need to look at here is what's said and what's not said. So in our translation we see, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out in the field." But if we look even at the Hebrew you can't read, we see, "And spoke Cain with his brother Abel, and it happened when they were in the field." So there's no actual speech. The "let us go out in the field" is only from the Septuagint. It's not from the English here. You see the Septuagint language there, which translates fairly into "let us go out in the field." So the Septuagint translators filled in what the original, or at least the Masoretic text scribes refused to put in, the words that Cain said to Abel. Instead, what we hear in the original is simply, "And Cain said to Abel his brother." And as we saw last time, Abel is always Cain's brother, but Cain is never named as Abel's brother. So he leads him out into the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And this echoes very closely a passage from the Wise Woman of Tekoa put up by Joab to get David to respond to the rape of Tamar by Amnon, and Tamar's brother Absalom plotting revenge against his dad. And so what we see there is she tells this little story to David, put in her mouth by Joab. "Your servant had 2 sons, and they fought with one another in the field. There was no one to part them, and one struck the other and killed him." Plainly a very similar story, and readers of the Bible in its context that we have it certainly see the Wise Woman of Tekoa story echoing the Cain and Abel story. But I'm going to suggest here that it may well be, and is likely to be, the other way around, that the Genesis story, just like in the Garden of Eden story, is saying something about Solomon's monarchy and maybe about monarchy altogether. The Cain and Abel story is recalling the fictional story that Joab puts in the mouth of the Wise Woman of Tekoa about 2 brothers. In that case, the 2 brothers are Amnon and Absalom. But perhaps we can also read this at a wider level, as we'll look at in the later in the videos that we do for the later part of the chapter, that maybe Cain and Abel are representatives of Israel and Judah, or their respective monarchies, the house of Saul and the house of David, in a time period reflecting upon the failure of monarchy from the time of exile. We'll come back to some of that more later. So the parallels between 2 Samuel 14 and what we see in Genesis can be read in either direction, and we'll explore more of many of the connections to the monarchy story in Genesis as we go. So when they were in the field, and the Hebrew here isn't even as clear as when they were. It's the root high for to be twice, and so one could awkwardly read it as "and he was with they were," which makes no sense, of course. So the translators try to put it in a form that we can make sense of. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up. The opposite of the advice you see in verse 7 there, which is to lie low in the face of sin, he rose up. So as his face fell, now he makes up for it by rising up. And of course his face fell because God didn't have regard. He wasn't actually angry at Abel, but he's displaced his anger at God to his brother. And isn't that a paradigm that so often takes place in human history, where frustration with one source is taken out at the source that's much more convenient, his brother rather than God. So Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And of course this is the first of 167 times we hear kill or to murder here. And almost always for private violence. It's a different word than like killing in war. So it's our first time. And we have to reckon with, what did killing mean? Within the story world, does Cain even know what he was going to do? Did he know that rising up would end the life of his brother? Certainly there's nothing in the story to suggest that, like some little kid who kills an insect or a small animal and doesn't really understand yet what killing is. There's been no warning about killing, and yet it happens. And we'll see what happens after that. But for a moment, let's just look at a few of the images we see from art. There are so many here, and we see them first from Titian here. Actually, before we see Titian, we see from the Ghent altarpiece that we saw last time. And then we see from Titian. and we see from Reuben's, and then we see one more here, of many pictures that have been made to try to show how this happened, what it would have looked like. But the biblical authors don't tell us that. They simply name what happens, and much of the story will focus on the aftermath. So as we continue next time, we'll see the textual energy is given not so much to the act itself, but to what Cain's response is. So see you for that next time. Bye-bye.